Good morning. Sorry I can't be with you in person this morning, but this is our second Sunday in the series on Bonhoeffer's Path of Christian Formation. I'm Vicki Barnett, and it's my pleasure to be with you again. I'll look forward to seeing you again next week. Today, I wanted to pick up on the second installment of our series and wanted to go first into some of the history of Finkenwalde and the specific context, including the historical pressures that these confessing church seminarians felt in this context. Then I want to talk a little bit about Bonhoeffer's time at Finkenwalde itself and the aftermath of that, and then conclude with some observations about how this shaped his understanding of Christian formation and that of his seminarians as a segue into our session next week when I'll be back with you, and we can talk more in depth about his books on discipleship and life together. So if you bear with me today, I'm going to begin with some history, including picking up where we left off last Sunday. I'm going to share my screen and pick up on this PowerPoint. Where is our slideshow? From the beginning. So this is the list of our sessions. Last week, we sort of talked in general about what Christian formation meant to Bonhoeffer and what we think of today when we think of it. Today, I'm talking about Bonhoeffer at Finkenwalde from 1935 to 1937, that period during which he was training seminarians in the confessing church. I'll also talk a little bit about the aftermath of that because that's also very important. And then next week, I want to talk more about his understanding of discipleship in community, in fellowship with other Christians. And then we'll continue to explore in the coming weeks exactly how that shaped he himself, as well as his seminarians, and then concluding with some reflections on how we might draw insights from these experiences as we explore what Christian formation means to us today. So last week, as you'll recall, I showed this slide, the historical context and the challenges that shaped Bonhoeffer's thought after 1933. Even before 1933, of course, you had the rise of this pro-Nazi German Christian faith movement in Germany. Here's an illustration of Ludwig Müller, who was the head of the German Christians, who after 1933 takes charge of the Protestant church and attempts to Nazify it. In reaction to this, is the rise of what we call the confessing church, the faction within the German Protestant church that fought back against these German Christians and fought back against this attempt to Nazify the church. They based their fight upon what was called the Barmen Declaration of Faith, the 6-point statement. We went over some of the points last week that clarified exactly what Christians believe in, what they don't believe in, and where the line falls between Christian faith and worldly influence on that faith. Barmen and this battle within German Protestantism led to a deep division within the German Protestant church, which eventually culminated in the establishment of separate independent seminaries for the confessing church, one of which was directed by Bonhoeffer, and this is the seminary at Finkenwalde, and it's during that period that he writes his classics on discipleship and life together. So what I'd like to do now is give a quick overview of the big landscape. I'm going to throw a lot of data at you, but the main point of all this is to give you a sense of how very complicated the Protestant church scene was between 1933 and 1939, because that's important for understanding exactly the battles that Bonhoeffer is trying to fight, as well as what he's trying to do. This is a map of the Protestant church in Germany after 1945. Unfortunately, I couldn't find one that showed all the different boundaries, but you can see where those boundaries were. I'm tracing them right now with my cursor. Before 1945, these are all different regional churches, Protestant churches in Germany that come directly out of the Reformation. That is, they're organized regionally. In 1933, there were 28 of these churches, and you'll see that they're color-coded in different ways. That color coding shows what stream of the Reformation they were shaped by. The orange churches are the Lutheran churches. These are the churches that after the Reformation identified as strictly Lutheran. The blue churches and the striped churches here are the Reformed churches, the churches that were more shaped by Calvinism, and governed accordingly. And then the green churches were the ones that were so-called united churches. That is, these are regions in which you have both Lutheran churches and Reformed churches. And so the governance structure terms itself a united church. That is, you have a mix of both. These different regions and how they were determined come directly out of the Reformation. In the centuries right after the Reformation, the landed nobility, the prince or the king or whoever governed that region of Germany, determined what faith it would be. And that's why you have some that go in the Reformed direction, some that take a Lutheran direction. But after the uniting of Germany into one Reich in the late 19th century, you begin to get firmer boundaries that really follow regional divides, not just confessional ones. And so these larger regions, or these larger colored areas, encompass several different regions. They encompass several different regional churches, but this shows what confession they identify with. And as this shows, the Protestant church in Germany, although it was one tradition, it was a Protestant tradition, and they all understood themselves as post-Reformation churches. They had different church structures. The Lutheran churches, for example, were governed very hierarchically. You had a bishop in charge of the church. The bishop had considerable power to determine, who served in the administration and how that church was governed. In the United Churches, at the other extreme, you really had a more congregationalist form of hierarchy. You didn't have a bishop of those churches. You had what was called a praeses, or a president. And the power was decentralized. And this played a big role after 1933, because in July of 1933, Hitler, in his attempt to Nazify the churches, called for national church elections and invited for the first time church lay people from across the country to vote for who they wanted to have control of their churches. And across Germany, the vast majority of Germans voted for the German Christians, that is the pro-Nazi faction. And this brought German Christians into the governance structure of all these different regional churches. And that then played a key role in the divisions that emerged after 1933 between the German Christians and those who opposed them. So briefly, I want to also show you the Old Prussian Union Church. This is an early 20th century outline of the map. You can see that it's spread out. This is basically the region of the Kingdom of Prussia, which encompass various regions. Berlin is right here, Westphalia is here, the Rhineland, Palatinate, Pomerania, this is where Finkenwalde was. So this was the church to which Bonhoeffer belonged. And you can see that it's spread out. It corresponds with what I just showed you to some extent with the United Church. So the Old Prussian Union Church was a United Church. In fact, it's the mother church of the United Church of Christ in this country historically. But the third map I want to show you is this one. This is the final free elections in Germany before the Nazis come to power. This is November 1932. The brown regions show where the vote was heavily in favor of the Nazis. The pink color is either the Social Democrat Party or the Catholic Center Party. And if you know your German religious demography, you know that these more regions that are more pink correspond with the regions in Germany where there's a majority Catholic population, whereas the heavily brown areas are the predominantly Protestant regions. And the very dark brown regions are those regions or those churches in which you actually have either a bishop who is, a member of the German Christians and perhaps even a member of the Nazi Party. In any case, these are the regions that are heavily so-called brown. That is, they're politically very pro-Nazi. The red regions are the major cities in which you have a large vote for the Communist Party, including Berlin. So that's how the demographics play out. But what that means in 1933, when Hitler calls for national church elections, and you begin to get these divides in the Protestant church, is you can see already that you have regions in which there's really a mix of some Nazi support, but also support for other political parties. regions in which there's strong support for the Nazis, and this corresponds to the dominance after 1933 of the German Christians, who begin to seize control of the governance structures of the Protestant church throughout Germany, and begin to shape Protestantism according to Nazi ideology. These are just some of the photographs that really show that. You can see that they begin to hold ceremonies in churches that were really sort of Nazified ceremony. The swastika flag, of course, is featured prominently in German Christian or German Protestant churches after this point. You can even see in this photograph here on the right, around the altar, you don't even see a cross anymore. You see the swastika and the German eagle above it, and then swastika flags surrounding the entire altar. So this is a radical change to Christian liturgy, Christian doctrine, Christian teaching. And as I mentioned last week, it immediately provokes a backlash against the German Christians in the form of the Confessing Church movement, which emerges from this Barmen Synod in May of 1934. Let me just touch on some of the points I made last week about Barmen. As I mentioned, you had delegates from all the different regional churches coming to Barmen, and they unanimously approved this declaration, which is significant. So even from churches that in 1934 are so-called brown churches, they're willing to sign on to this. And the reason is that it's very carefully formulated to make it clear, what Christians believe in and where they will draw a line, even in churches that were politically favorable to National Socialism. There was a great deal of nervousness about direct state control of the church. And there was a recognition that what the German Christians were doing crossed the line into heretical teaching. That is, in their attempt to de-Judicize the church, in their attempt to proclaim a new so-called Aryan church or a Germanic church, in their changes to liturgy, in the things like the removal of the cross, in getting rid of the Old Testament scriptures. For theologically orthodox Protestants, this was going way too far. And so Karl Barth managed to write a statement that unified people in terms of the seriousness of the German Christian heresies and the ways in which they were perverting Christian doctrine ideologically. The theses also, I would say, draw a implicit demarcation between church and state. The church is saying, here's where we stand as a church, and we can't cross this line to become an ideological appendage of the state. It did, however, stay away from explicit criticism of the Nazi state, which is probably why it got a unanimous vote. It was very careful. It didn't cross that line. It did not mention the persecution of the Jews, which was very intense by that point. And there was no explicit condemnation of Nazi leadership or the Nazi state. All there was the claim that the Nazi leader could not oversee the governance of the church. Despite this unanimous vote, however, the different regional church governments began to draw very different conclusions about what it really meant. With some in the Confessing Church seeing this as opening the way to real political opposition. They felt that Barmen, was clear enough that it was basically, declaring that the Nazi state was acting in an anti-Christian way. And others were insisting that it was simply preserving the church's private space, that it was designed to prevent state control of the church. Several months later, there's a second synod of the Confessing Church, and this is where things fall apart based on the divisions I was just describing. In October 1934, the churches come back together at Dahlem, a suburb of Berlin. Dahlem is the site of the large Annenkirche, which was a prominent church in Berlin, 3 leading pastors, and the leading pastor was a man named Martin Niemöller, whose name you might recognize. Niemöller became the figurehead of the Confessing Church because he had such a prominent pulpit and had by this time swung very clearly to open criticism of the Nazi state. In the months since Barmen, the divisions between these church factions had intensified. So in the three Lutheran churches that were called intact churches, the leadership managed to maintain oversight of the governance and all of the congregations. That's why they were called intact churches. Despite the German Christians being elected to certain seats in their governance, the bishops had a strong enough leadership role that they could control that. In the Prussian Union churches, however, you had very deeply divided factions, which throughout Prussia, including in Berlin, including in the eastern regions, and especially in the region of Westphalia, you began to have groups that simply said they couldn't work together. They couldn't share a church together. You had cases of the German Christians calling the Gestapo in to seal up a church so that the confessing church pastor couldn't go in. And eventually in Westphalia, what you had were two separate church governments. One was the German Christian government in Munster, one was the confessing church government in Westphalia. So this is all happening just in the months since Barmen. And then you had the 9 regional churches that were under control of so-called German Christian bishops, that is, bishops who had joined this faction and who were, fairly loyal to the regime. Think back to the map I showed you of the deeply brown regions. Those are the German Christian governed regions. So you have a German church across the country that is deeply divided with lots of different views of what's happening and different leadership styles. And these people who were unanimous in Barmen in terms of what they believed in no longer agree with each other at Dahlem. So at the Dahlem Synod, 2 of the Lutheran churches actually are not represented because their bishops are under house arrest by the Nazi regime. In Bavaria and Württemberg, the Nazi regime put both bishops under house arrest when they refused to follow the Ministry of Church Affairs that the Nazis had just set up. A clear split was emerging between these churches and the Prussian Union churches, where all hell was breaking loose. And only half of the delegates even showed up in the final session to vote for the closing resolution. And of those voting, the final vote on the Dahlem resolutions was 52 for, 20 against. So you see a church which is unanimous in May 1934. By October, it's really beginning to fall apart. The Dahlem resolutions effectively set up a new church governance structure along the lines of those who were absolutely committed to the confessing church. Part of that was to set up 5 new independent seminaries, one of which would be Finkenwalde. And those who voted in favor of these resolutions called themselves the Dahlemites after the Dahlem Synod. All of these factions, however, are still part of one church. And this is the thing that I wanted to emphasize, that when Bonhoeffer takes over Finkenwalde, the German Protestant church is a mess. It never completely breaks into separate churches. It's still a federation of very different regional churches that have very different approaches to navigating the treacherous terrain of church-state affairs under Nazi Germany. And you had very different theological opinions and very different ecclesial opinions. By October 1934, there was a growing middle-of-the-road set of leaders in the German Protestant church who saw the German Christians and the confessing church as equally troublesome. They felt that the German Christians were one extreme group and the confessing church was another extreme group. And what they desperately wanted to do was keep the church together. They didn't want it to split literally into separate churches. And so after Dahlem, they maintain that. You have this federation of different regional churches. You have subsets within each regional church of people who've decided they're going to go their own way. But if they were ordained and brought into the German clergy before that date, their ordinations were valid, recognized as valid. They had standing in the German Protestant church, and they got their salary from the German Protestant church, which was a state church. And this is another important aspect of this history. It's another reason why they didn't want the church to fall apart. And so people like Martin Niemöller in Dahlem, or Dietrich Bonhoeffer for that matter, who were already ordained, were recognized as clergy in the confessing church. After Dahlem, however, people who wanted to study at one of these new independent seminaries were deliberately moving outside that framework and were studying illegally under church law. They couldn't be ordained by the official church. And this began to play a major role. But as I said, the factions remain part of the German evangelical church. And you had cases even within a single church where there were deep divisions. One example being Martin Niemöller's church in Dahlem, a large church. There were 3 head pastors. Niemöller was one of them. Niemöller was radically outspoken about the Nazi regime by the fall of 1934. He had become a very outspoken critic, even though he had voted for Hitler in the last elections. The other 2 ministers were much more moderate. They didn't want to, make waves, and they didn't get along very well with Niemöller. And so by 1936, 1937, within this one congregation, you have 3 factions that don't get along with each other. And the congregation kind of divides itself accordingly. For my first book, For the Soul of the People, I interviewed a woman who had been the church secretary in Dahlem, and she explained to me how deep the animosity was. So it's kind of a microcosm of a much larger phenomenon across the German Protestant church during this era of the deep divisions and the fact that you still have this one institution. During all this excitement, Bonhoeffer is actually not in Germany. He's gone to London. He leaves Germany in September of 1933. He stays in London, serving 2 German congregations there until the spring of 1935. He left in September 1933 because he believes that there should be a clear break with the German Christians, and he's frustrated by the hesitance of the German church leaders to do that. That is, Bonhoeffer believes that there should be a schism. He says, we don't believe in the same God, the same Jesus Christ, the same Bible that the German Christians do. How can we be in the same church with them? And so he's very critical of these attempts to bridge the gaps and keep everybody together. He affirms the Barmen Declaration, although he does not attend the Barmen Synod. And he brings his London churches into the confessing church following Barmen. After October 1934, he fully affirms the Dahlemite decisions that are made in the Dahlem Synod and is invited to return in the spring of 1935 to direct this new confessing church seminary at Finkenwalde, which he does until September 1937, when it becomes illegal. From September 1937 to May 1939, he then oversees illegal training of seminarians. This is after these seminaries have been declared illegal by the state, and he begins to continue to try to educate seminarians. In the summer of 1939, he comes briefly to Union Theological Seminary in New York, exploring the option of perhaps staying in the United States, then deciding to return to Germany before the war breaks out. He continues to maintain contact with his underground pastorates, with these underground seminarians, until it all dissolves in August of 1940, mainly because almost everyone is now enlisted in the military. So these are some pictures of Bonhoeffer's seminarians. You can see Bonhoeffer here in the mid left-hand row in Finkenwalde, and this is a picture of them sitting out in the woods talking. This is one of the Confessing Church publications, which reflects Bonhoeffer's stance. The top line there that says "Entweder oder" means either or, and for Bonhoeffer, it's a clear choice. It's either the cross of Christ or the swastika and the sort of pseudo cross of the German Christians. I want to add that during this period, there are also women theologians, women seminarians studying in the Confessing Church. The first women to finish their theological academic training graduate in the late 1920s. So they're beginning their careers and their pursuit of the ministry right as the church struggle is beginning under National Socialism. The vast majority of them find their way to the Confessing Church. And these are the women who eventually they fight for ordination throughout the 1930s. They are not ordained, the church won't ordain them. And yet after 1939, when most of the men are soldiers on the front, they're the ones who end up serving the Confessing Church during the wartime, with many of them eventually being ordained after 1945. Bonhoeffer does not include any of these women at Finkenwalde. There are men in the Confessing Church who stand with them in their fight for ordination. Bonhoeffer does not. He doesn't say anything against them. But it's rather striking that in this battle within the confessing church, that on this one, he's really on the sidelines. So let me go over some of the key events in Finkenwalde and the subsequent stage between 1935 and 1939. Finkenwalde exists as a confessing church seminary for the first 2 years until August of 1937. During that time, it's considered illegal under church law. That means that these young men who are coming to study in Finkenwalde have no guarantees. They're not going to be ordained by the official church. They're not going to be given pastorates. So if they want a job, they're going to have to find a confessing church that will take them and will support them financially and support their families financially. So the people who study in these confessing church seminaries are really taking a risk career-wise, and of course in the context of Nazi Germany politically, because they're being identified as this radical breakaway group within the church. Several key events that happened during those first 2 years of Finkenwalde. In 1936, the confessing church composes a protest memorandum, which it sends directly to Adolf Hitler. It's about 20 pages long. And in it, it really delineates all the ways in which the confessing church believes that the Nazi state is acting in an anti-Christian way and in a way that hurts the church. So the statement really crosses that line. It includes a paragraph that accuses the Nazi regime of its anti-Semitism and condemns that anti-Semitism. Niemöller works on it, Bonhoeffer works on it, one of his seminarians work on it. The protest memorandum is sent secretly to Hitler, is leaked to the foreign press. And so within several weeks, it has been published in the New York papers and all the major European papers, and is causing somewhat of an international uproar. And at that point, the regime responds. They respond by imprisoning one of Bonhoeffer's seminarians, a man named Werner Koch, who was involved in it. He's imprisoned for 2 years. They also imprison a confessing church lawyer, Friedrich Weissler, who is Jewish. He is imprisoned, and as a Jew, he is immediately killed. He's beaten to death in Sachsenhausen, in fact, which shows the repercussions of Nazi law for those sectors of the confessing church, both that were were Jewish under Nazi law and had also kind of crossed that political line. Then, in August of 1937, Heinrich Himmler issues a decree that makes these seminarians illegal under state law. So up to now, they've been illegal in terms of the church. Now they're illegal under state law, which is a different level of persecution. His decree also bans a number of confessing church activities, like taking up church collections, like having Bible studies. And so it's a real state crackdown on this radical wing of the confessing church. And at this point, excuse me again, I'm going to mute myself. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit hoarse. At this point, the church leaders in Berlin, the mainstream church, offer something called legalization to the confessing church seminarians. And legalization is a path to full recognition of ordination and full recognition of their ordination, and a placement in the church, a full salary, all the benefits, all the job security. In a way, it's reaching out to these people who are becoming more and more under the target of the state and saying, okay, you trained in a confessing church seminary, we'll accept that. You just have to come and take your ordination exams by a state from one of the state church committees. We'll ordain you, and then you can be a fully ordained pastor in the German church. Bonhoeffer is adamantly opposed to this, and this is really for him one of his here I stand moments. As I mentioned, in 1933, he said, we can't be in the same church with the German Christians. Now in 1937, he says the same thing, but the stakes for his seminarians are much higher. So from 1937 to 1940, these seminaries are now illegal. They go underground. They begin to meet in rural parsonages, in rural estates. They continue to have Bible studies. Bonhoeffer begins to write a series of circular letters. He travels around to visit them. And during this period, the persecution of these seminarians intensifies. So by November of 1937, 27 of the seminarians who have studied with Bonhoeffer are imprisoned for various things, none of them for very long, but it shows that the state is beginning to reach out and crack down on them. In January of 1938, Bonhoeffer himself is banned from traveling to Berlin and to various regions, and that's followed by a ban on public speaking. And then in February of 1938 is the trial of Martin Niemöller, who is then imprisoned in concentration camps until 1945. So you can see during this period the steady progression within the church first of the marginalization of these people, and then after 1937, the fact that this becomes an issue in terms of the state as well. 2 points to make about all this. One is Bonhoeffer's consistent advocacy and demand that his seminarians recognize that the confessing church is the only real Protestant church in Germany, that the German Christians are not a true Christian church. And he's very angry at the so-called neutral church leadership, which is trying to keep everybody together, because he feels that there should be a clear, decisive split. What does this mean? It means that he believes that the German Christians should either be excluded from the official church, that means from the ministry, from holding positions, or that the confessing church should make a clean break and really break away. Despite the Dahlem resolutions, neither of these things ever really happens. Even though you get confessing churches that kind of govern themselves, they're still part of this larger church. The second thing he does, is advocate that foreign churches and the ecumenical movement recognize the confessing church as the only legitimate Protestant church in Germany. Bonhoeffer during the 1930s makes a number of trips to ecumenical meetings or to meet with international church leaders, and this is his consistent demand. From the point of view of the international church, they're trying to keep their avenues of communication open to all the factions of the church in Germany, and so they never take that break either. And Bonhoeffer is, by the end of the 1930s, immensely frustrated and unhappy that he has not found that clear support internationally that he hoped for. As the pressures on the confessing church seminaries intensify, my apologies, it's that time of year when I get hoarse when I speak. As the pressures intensify, especially after the 1937 offer to legalize Bonhoeffer seminarians, he makes a famous declaration: whoever breaks from the confessing church breaks with salvation. That is, he says, this is the one church of Jesus Christ in Germany, and anyone who leaves the confessing church is breaking with the promises of Christ for salvation. Not surprisingly, perhaps, he comes under heavy criticism, even from other Dahlemites, because they say, how can you determine who is saved or not? But it shows how firmly he stands on this position. One of the moving things about this period is, he has, I'll talk about this more next week, he has all these seminarians who come to study with him in Finkenwalde who have really given up everything at considerable risk to follow this path of the confessing church. This is what they believe in. But as the pressures intensify, some of them are tempted to take this offer of legalization. And when I was working on my first book, I happened to interview a man who had been one of these students. And I had not known the story of legalization until he told it to me. But he was one of two seminarians from one of the classes at Finkenwalde who accepted the offer of legalization. And Bonhoeffer broke with them completely. He stopped speaking to them. They were not welcome to come back. He did not correspond with them. He was absolute on this issue. And this man, I interviewed him in the 1980s, so decades after this had happened. He asked to remain anonymous. He had never told certain people that he had done this. He was both ashamed, I would say, and somewhat resentful. I mean, what he told me was that he was married, he had 2 young children, he was increasingly afraid of what might happen, and this was a path to security. And so you can sort of glean from that story the pressures on people and the clarity of Bonhoeffer and what this really meant in that context. So where am I? I'm trying to go to my screen here. Yeah. So what does this mean in terms of practices of Christian formation? I think first and foremost, it illustrates that trying to live as a faithful Christian in the context of Nazi Germany was extremely difficult. It meant you made enemies. You came under state pressure. You came under church pressure. You became a target. It was a very lonely path, especially after 1935. What Bonhoeffer then began to teach his seminarians was to think about what this meant in terms of discipleship, following Christ, not some worldly ideology or false Messiah, and following Christ with all that that meant. Bonhoeffer's book on discipleship, the first line, and if you've read this book, you'll sound familiar, he kind of throws down the gauntlet. Cheap grace is the mortal enemy of our church. Our struggle today is for costly grace. Cheap grace means grace as bargain basement goods, cut rate forgiveness, cut rate comfort, cut rate sacrament. Grace is the church's inexhaustible pantry from which it is doled out by careless hands without hesitation or limit. Cheap grace means justification of sin, but not the sinner. This clear, adamant insistence of what it means to live by grace, where he says, costly grace is the hidden treasure in the field for the sake of which people go and sell everything they have. It is the gospel which must be sought again and again. It is costly because it calls to discipleship. It is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is a ringing call in the context of Nazi Germany. And you can see why it both resonates deeply with his seminarians. The ones who stay with him are passionate about what they learn from him. And the ones who fall short find that they simply can't live up to it. So this notion of discipleship as following Christ in this world, wherever that takes you, has definite costs and risks in a context like Nazi Germany. And therefore, he emphasizes the absolute importance of community and fellowship. What he wants to nurture in his groups at Finkenwalde are these bonds of absolute trust so that they know they can depend on each other. If the Gestapo comes and arrests one of them, he knows that others will step in and help his family, that they'll help with financial support, that they'll keep an eye out for what's going on. As part of this in Finkenwalde, and I'll talk about this more next week, he instills daily practices of prayer, of confession, of hymn reading, of Bible study that can strengthen and deepen their individual resolve and commitment to this larger fellowship of the church. And he nurtures an understanding of discipleship as a countercultural act, really. As Matthew's saying, you are the salt of the earth. Bonhoeffer's saying you can only be the salt of the earth if you are truly following the gospel. And that's where this distinction between cheap grace and costly grace comes in. And so you can see the extent or the ways in which this kind of spiritual formation, this training in a spiritual centeredness that gives Christians a place on the margins of their society, that makes them sort of outsiders. And in the case of Nazi Germany, this is definitely what happened. Clearly running, counter to the dominant political powers, that it is in and of itself a form of resistance. And that's what really comes out of these communities in Finkenwalde. In the war, from 1935 to 1945, just to give you some statistics, because this experiment in seminary education is cut short by the invasion of Poland and the beginning of the Second World War. By the fall of 1944, almost half of the ordained clergy and almost all of the seminarians or candidates for the ministry were in the German military. And the vast majority of the illegal seminarians that were studying the confessing church, the ones who had really kind of stepped outside the flow, the vast majority of them were mobilized immediately in September of 1939 and sent to the front. So over half of Bonhoeffer's seminarians were killed in the war. They were drafted early. And one of the most moving aspects in the Bonhoeffer works is the volume that covers sort of that early war period, where Bonhoeffer is both writing the seminarians who have not yet been called up, and writing their families, keeping in touch with the families of seminarians who have been killed in the war. Bonhoeffer continues to pastor to these people as long as he can. As I noted, the confessing church then during the war was taken care of primarily by these women theologians, some of whom then were given so-called emergency ordinations, and the older and retired clergy. So after 1945, the seminarians who had survived and the students who had studied under Bonhoeffer, there was a core group that had really stayed with him throughout and really hoped to continue to maintain the model of the confessing church as he had created, as the sort of true church that didn't conform to worldly powers, that maintained its critical voice within the system. The evangelical church of Germany reconstituted itself soon after the end of the war, but this group continued to meet. They considered themselves sort of the confessing church in a post-war setting, even though many of them, of course, were ordained then and served parishes in the German Protestant church. They continued to hold meetings of the Council of Brethren, which was the oversight committee formed in Dahlem that oversaw the different confessing churches. And they called themselves the Unterwegs Circle, the on-the-road circle, and even published a small journal called Unterwegs, where some of Bonhoeffer's writings, I've dropped a word here, from this period of the 1930s were first published. So that's a very quick run through of a turbulent period, but I wanted to give you this overview just to really give you a sense of what this meant, what the background of Finkenwalde was, what kinds of pressures they were under, and to think of Christian formation in that sort of intense setting in which the stakes were unbelievably high. Bonhoeffer, has very distinct periods of his short life, and of course, I'll talk a little bit more about this in the coming weeks. After 1939, in the spring of 1939, he hands the leadership of Finkenwalde over to someone else. When he comes back from New York in the summer of 1939, he's immediately drawn into resistance circles and this ends up being the beginning of his period of resistance. But even then, I think that for Bonhoeffer, he found himself and he found his vocation in Finkenwalde in a way that is really remarkable. And one sees that actually in his writings and in his letters from this period. There's a sense that he can sort of let out a deep breath, and after these early battles with the leadership of the confessing church in the first 2 years of Nazi rule, he's finally in a place where he can do something. And this focus on Christian formation becomes so central to him, and he doesn't lose it. I think he carries the structures and the sensibility and the commitment to discipleship through till the end of his life. So this, understanding this period and all the pressures and what he's trying to do in these seminaries is a key part of understanding, his writings on Christian formation and perhaps some of what we can learn from it today. So I will wind up there. I would add, if you have questions based either on the first week or on this session, please do feel free to send them to me by email. What I'll try to do is weave them into our third session, maybe try to answer some of them then. So thank you so much for your attention today. I hope you have a good week, stay healthy, and I will see you again next week.